Hi, guys, and welcome to a special podcast today, which has not really much to do with Elliott waves, but mainly focusing on the recent debacle between Ukraine and Russia. We have heard that, and of course, we know that there has been an invasion. It's probably like a week now. And I wanted to just bring the subject to my attention, of course, and to yours, just to clear a few things out a little bit, because the reality is that, and I'm also disappointed to say that we live in a society full of, in the social media, it's just what I see around. It's crazy. Fake news all over the place. So I wanted to invite a very good friend of mine as well, a financial analyst, Daniel. Daniel, thanks for joining here and trying to help us demystify what is really going on between Ukraine and Russia, and then I guess, of course, the rest of the involved countries, because it's not just that. Thank you for joining. And I think.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks for having me on and giving it a place for me to soapbox for a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I think it's very important that we highlight some key points of the situation, why it escalated. Before we start, I just want to say as well that I am, of course, very saddened to see that taking place just around our door in Europe. A lot of people have been forced to leave their houses for their safety, and I do hope that they are all safe and there won't be any more casualties, because there have been casualties. And I send my prayers to all the families, whichever side they think they are on. I'm with the people's side. So shall we just take a dive a little bit and start with some background information? Can you tell us maybe when this recent escalation really began?
Oh, well, that's always a complicated question whenever it comes to the geopolitics thing, because you can go back, you can set a point, and then you say, well, why did that happen? You can keep going back all the way, years and years and years. So, it's pretty much it can be kind of arbitrarily. Like, a lot of people sort of became aware of it, I guess, with the most recent invasion, which was, well, I guess with the buildup of, to the supposed exercises that they're doing, which started sometime in January. Because before that, we were all paying attention to COVID, obviously. Now, no one almost forgot about that. But then, of course, there's a lot of people who are well aware of the 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and the now infamous little green men. And that created, of course, the meme of, Russia saying, what troops? I don't have any troops. Where are troops? And then that thing. So I suppose maybe 2014, there, and what happened, and then I think go from there, because that's sort of like when everyone sort of said, hey, that was the first time that Russia took a portion of Ukraine. And then, of course, from the Russian side, they say, well, no, the piece that Crimea was always part of Russia. And then, of course, that has a complication to it. And so there's plenty of complications to talk about and to branch out from.
From what I recall, it was back in 2013 when we can go back to 1991 of the dissolution of the USSR, but I think we're not going to do a lesson of history here. I think everybody can really just go online and do that themselves. But I recall just recently that before the Crimea thing, what was the situation between Ukraine and Russia was, we can all just remember the Maidan Revolution. There was something like the then president Yanukovych refused to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, and this what has actually spiked the Maidan Revolution, because a lot of the Ukrainian people wanted to actually participate in the trade agreement with the European Union. And then, the sort of revolution of dignity, also known as called, it started. It's been said and noted from many different sources, and there is evidence that there is some sort of rise of far right since back then in the Ukraine. I wouldn't say a government or parliament or anything, but in general, there's been some independent teams back then, actually, which joined later. They were pretty much integrated into the National Guard of the Ukraine in 2014. Obviously, back then, the two other separate areas as well asked for independence. Donetsk and Luhansk, right?
Luhansk, yeah.
And I mean, since then, it's been a bit of a war that nobody has actually heard of, and people have not talked about. It's been since that 8 years, of course. The situation between Ukrainian forces and the independent forces, has escalated many times, and there's been conflicts very often between them. But coming back to now, suddenly we see escalation from an invasion, and we see markets, most of the markets falling, including, of course, the stocks and BTC, which I recall back in when the escalation in Crimea took place. BTC fell some 50% following the event. I think there was some sort of relief for a few months, and then it continued the decline. Now we see something similar maybe taking place. We saw initial move to the downside, right? And then we see again a relief rally. We don't know how this is going to pan out, obviously. But what we do know is that some other markets are very, very bullish, including natural gas, oil, and that is, of course, if you want to give us a bit more insight here, because of the European Union's dependency on Russia's energies, should I say?
Yeah, well, there was something you mentioned there about BTC, which I was going to go back to, because back in 2014, Bitcoin wasn't really well known, I guess. And so now, especially after COVID, it's gotten quite explosive. So I suppose the market back in 2014 would behave differently, because you had a lot more tech people, more geeky types. I don't know if that's the right word to call it, who are involved in crypto. And now it's sort of, you have more lay people who many of them don't know that much about economics or maybe tech. It's kind of gone more mass market, I guess. And so maybe some of the people who are more experts in it might be, well, they probably react a little bit differently than the mass market types. But that might also be a contributing factor to the way crypto's behaving. And of course, there's a lot more cryptos now than there used to be.
Yeah, and more markets, derivatives, options as well, and the institutions are involved, true. So you have a feeling that we might not get a replication of the situation just because it happened historically one time. Doesn't really mean that it will definitely mirror the same.
But it's always a good guide. So it's sort of like something to think, how that would also reflect in the current situation as well.
So, okay, how do you see Bitcoin? Obviously, it really depends on what's going to happen going forward. But how do you see BTC being affected going forward if we assume that there is no further escalation?
Oh, well, I would guess it's a matter of risk evaluation. So I would expect most of the drop in cryptos now is due to people worrying about what's going to happen. And of course, any asset doesn't really like uncertainty. So we've had a lot of, everything's been going down, practically speaking, except for gold and bonds and of course, oil. So right, since there's so much uncertainty, just as a matter of how long it's going to take that uncertainty to resolve, and then we could get crypto going back up, and then the more normal dynamics would then reassert themselves. Figuring out how the Fed and interest rate policy would impact it. But then, of course, the other thing is a lot of these sanctions that are going on against Russia are oriented specifically towards the financial market, and so that might create an attractiveness for other people who are worried about how governments can interfere in people's normal functioning and buying and selling stuff. And then, of course, you have the other thing that happened with Canada quite recently, which got a lot of other people more interested in cryptos. So, there's several complicating factors that could go forward. But assuming there's no increased escalation and assuming that nothing happens to the oil market, which is what everyone's really worried about, I would expect crypto to have something of a rebound. Or at least based on risk assessment.
Yeah. So we are definitely talking for a risk asset here. There is no properties of a hedge against inflation here, right? Just to make sure that we are loud and clear on that.
Yeah, it's a little too volatile to say it's a good hedge for the moment. That doesn't mean that in the future it might not be. But inflation, we're talking about maybe 7-8%. What's going at 7-8% now? Maybe it'll be up to 10%. But yeah, crypto goes like 50%.
Exactly. Or it might just drop, but inflation doesn't fall. Now, grabbing on that last, inflation goes up. Obviously, there's different reasons why inflation goes up, but as I initiated this second question, which seemed to be more of a discussion thing. We do have an issue with energy prices moving up exponentially, especially in the European Union, and that partially, should I say, or because of speculation as well. But now with sanctions, it might be a case where it's not going to be. It might not be as speculative. Do you think? Because the rise has been actually recently is very evident because we crossed triple digits in oil, and we saw like a spike of 20% over the past few days, maybe even less than 2 days. But it started moving up like a few months ago. Do you think that we can relate this spike to something else?
The most recent spike, maybe, but like there's other things that have been pushing oil further. I mean, that's been pushing oil up, and this just makes it so much worse, I think, because there's sort of like underlying dynamics that are going on. I mean, I used to think before the invasion thing happened, I sort of expected oil to peak out at maximum somewhere about 90 and then go down.
I remember I told you about it too, but then probably a bad trade there.
But then that was at the time when pretty much no one was really expecting the invasion to happen. So now that we've been caught by surprise, now we have a different outlook. So the things that you have is that there's a mismatch between the supply and demand because of the disruption that happened with COVID, and so that's taking a little while to resolve. And the thing about Russia right now is that one of the primary reasons that prices are going up is that because the people who use oil don't know whether Russia's actually going to be staying in the market. Because when you do one of these oil contracts, you do it for the future. It's not like you buy oil and then you get it immediately. You're buying oil at 30 days. So the question is the situation going to escalate or not over the next 30 days? And then so a lot of buyers of oil are not signing contracts with Russian suppliers because they don't know if they'll be able to get delivery of it. And so they're willing to pay a premium to buy oil outside. of Russia. And one of the major problems, of course, is that Russia's total production, the spare capacity that exists in the rest of the world, outside of considering OPEC, OPEC does have, there have the restrictions, but the spare capacity that exists isn't enough to cover Russia. So if Russia's taken out of the global oil market for whatever reason, there isn't enough supply of oil amongst the other countries to make up for it. And of course, that would massively push up the price of oil, and that would make the people that are consuming it, the energy companies would have a significant problem.
Yeah. And so just to make it clear to the listeners, in oil prices moving up push inflation up, which means costs rising in general. So it makes, of course, purchasing power, of the dollar even, So it's an issue which becomes more of a problem as well for central banks.
But there's a lot of moving parts to it.
Yeah. Since you mentioned supply, I do recall few months ago, there were a delay in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany. Do you think this plays a role to what we currently see happening? I wouldn't just say in the markets, but partially also in the escalation between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Because there's a timing issue. We know that the prices of energy in Europe started going up in September of last year. Going a little bit further back with Nord Stream. Nord Stream was being built, of course, to get around the Ukraine, because Russia's ships about half of the current oil current natural gas, that's consumed by Europe goes through the Ukraine, and the Ukraine, of course, charges money for that. And then there's the other political thing. So there's good reason for Russia to want to get the oil to go around the Ukraine, and that's what Nord Stream 2. The idea of Nord Stream 2 was to bypass Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, would it be just Ukraine or other countries too? Or is it just because, we're talking about, only the border between, the hub, let's call it, is Ukraine, right? Between Russia or East Asia and Europe.
Yeah, pretty much. The other, it's either Ukraine or Belarus, which is a little bit, which isn't really much of an improvement as far as lack of corruption and such, and in reliability. Yeah. So getting it to go, down the Baltic Sea would end up being an improvement. Yeah. So anyway, that was originally planned, and then this would increase the dependency of Germany and Europe on Russia for the supply of oil. And so during the Trump administration, they stopped it. They said they weren't going to allow it to go through. And then the Biden administration changed tact, and then they allowed it to go through because, they have a different philosophy. And the thing is, it would have become functional. It became the whole structure was built, and they did send technical gas, if I remember correctly, sometime in November. And so, assuming all the regulatory improvements had been done, Nord Stream 2 would have been able to start shipping gas in December through the winter. But of course, the problems happened, and it wasn't able to supply.
So the pipeline is there, correct?
Yeah, the pipeline is there, and it's just a matter of turning on the pipe if you have
whose responsibility is to approve it? We're not talking about just turning the thing on. Whose responsibility is to say, okay, we are starting now?
There's several. You have to have the approvals on the Russian side, and then of course you have to have the approvals on the EU side.
Right.
But the Russian side is of course very eager to do it. Right now, the problem is with Germany, because there was a court resolution that said that you couldn't, because the company that owns that is the operator of it. It's basically a subsidiary of Gazprom and BP and Shell. Sorry. But the holding company that owns it is based in Switzerland, and there was this thing that in Germany you couldn't run it if you didn't have a company based in Germany. And so then they were going to and that's what stopped Yeah,
Okay,
but
let me
then
ask you
that's
something
kind of
here
like a
now,
really
because
technical.
this is a question in the back of my mind. So the Trump administration frozen this, and there were
Yeah,
apparently some issues in that they were supposed to be sorted between the European countries here, right? But then Biden
yeah.
comes in and says, "Okay, you can go ahead." I'm just not understanding what is the West's involvement here, and how do they get to decide what Germany is going to do between with Russia or not?
Oh, well, in the particular, the United States has the ability to put sanctions on anyone who is doing business with essentially Nord Stream. And so they can't say, we're not going to allow, you to build it because it's something that's entirely outside of their jurisdiction. But they can say, if any company deals with Nord Stream, then we're not going to deal with them.
Right,
And,
and why would they
that would
do that?
put.
Just trying to get to the point here.
Oh, well, the argument of the Trump administration was that it created too much dependency
Right.
on Russia,
Okay.
and so they wanted Germany to find other sources of energy.
Okay. So
Specifically.
basically, it's like dump them, come to me. Think right. Just to be a bit more
I,
clear.
I mean that could be one of the ways to look at
Yeah.
it, but one of the things that the Trump administration was really pushing was, of course, nuclear, because you had that whole problem with the following the Fukushima disaster. Germany decided to get rid of all of its nuclear power,
Uh-huh.
and
So
they're supposed to replace it with green energy,
yeah.
but the green energy hasn't been reliable enough for that, and so that means if you take out base power, you can fix that by putting in peaking power, which you get from natural gas, among other things. And so they've been relying increasingly on peaking power, which you get from natural gas. And it's been really cheap to get natural gas
Right.
from Russia. So it hasn't been a problem right up
Right.
until
And
now.
Biden comes in and he says, "Let's do it."
Yeah.
What's the benefit out of this?
Well, officially it was because they wanted to improve relations with Russia and resolve pending tensions, and by creating economic interdependence. It's a general theory. Also, the Germans are believers in this theory. That if you have economic interdependence, between countries, then those countries are less likely to have political tensions, because they're less likely to go to war, because both countries need each other, and so they aren't going to create a problem that would interfere with the things that they need.
Right.
And apparently that theory isn't working out very well.
Well, instead, no. I mean, it's just to me, it's just some things happen in a chronological order that you cannot not think why that is.
Yeah.
So I keep also
Yeah.
thinking, last time that we had escalation between Ukraine and Russia was in 2014.
Yeah.
Who was the president of the U.S.?
That would be Barack Obama, but
Right. So
his vice
yeah,
president, of course,
and
was Joe Biden.
Joe Biden was vice president, and now Biden is the president, and we have
Yeah.
escalation again. I mean, maybe this is some sort of speculation, which maybe we want to avoid, but given the sensitivity of the subject, but I'm just wondering why.
Well, it does seem to be like a really curious coincidence. You know, you don't necessarily have like certain things are a little too coincidental. That's all.
Right. Coincidentally, I happen to remember something else. Maybe you can help. Trump was calling for an investigation on Biden's son, Hunter. Is it Hunter
Yeah,
Biden?
Hunter is currently living son. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you know and remember more than I do. Can you enlighten us a little bit on this topic?
Oh, that was a pretty big scandal in the United States in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Because it was right. It was it was right before. No, 2019. It was right before COVID really started, where there were these allegations going around that, Hunter Biden was hired by this company called Burisma, which is in the natural gas business in Ukraine. And he was being paid an exorbitant amount of money, and Hunter Biden, of course, doesn't have much experience in running a natural gas company, so it was kind of questionable. And so there was this accusation that was going around that his father, then Vice President Joe Biden, had gone to Ukraine and threatened to get the prosecutor that was investigating this Burisma company to be fired, and threatened to withhold aid to the Ukraine on that basis. That was the allegation. And so the Trump administration, well, Trump personally called up the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, and asked them to investigate Joe Biden to see if he was involved in that. And that, of course, ends up being a scandal, because now you have the sitting president calling up a foreign leader and asking him to investigate who is ultimately a political rival. And that led to Trump's impeachment. But now it still ends up being a little bit of an issue, considering that natural gas is the main conflict point, we could say, around this war that now Joe Biden is kind of involved in as president of the United States.
So what you are saying is that there are resources there, right?
Yeah,
And
that's the
evidently.
other thing that a lot of people, I guess, probably don't really consider the economic aspect of the Ukraine, because you have the natural gas is mostly in Russia right now, and it's just being transited through Ukraine. But the Ukraine also, in 2012, it discovered natural gas deposits both off the shore of Crimea and in what is now called, well, it's always been called Donbass, but at the time people didn't really make the association with Donbass. And so now, but the Ukraine is a relatively poor country. It doesn't have the resources to start its own exploration of natural gas. And so that natural gas has still been sitting there. But it could give the Ukraine not only energy independence, but Ukraine could then start producing its own natural gas and competing with Russia if they were to develop those fields. And the problem is, of course, is one of the aspects of the current crisis around Ukraine is related to Crimea and Donbass.
So let me get this straight, because it's just striking that a country in the middle of, between Russia and Europe, which currently has pipelines under their ground supplying gas and charging for it, has natural gas in there, more natural gas from what is supposedly thought from anybody, because I doubt many people know that, but all the way opposite to the west, someone is coming in to help extract that natural gas. And I mean, what do Ukraine's or Russia's job pretty much? Is this the?
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, there's another element about the Ukraine which a lot of people don't. I mean, there's a lot of people who are in favor of the Ukraine right now because they're sort of seen as the underdog. They're being attacked by Russia. This big country is attacking this little small country, and they sort of like feel sympathy towards Ukraine. But the thing is, the Ukraine, yes, is a really poor country, but it's also a really corrupt country. There's a massive amount of corruption in Ukraine.
Recall.
Yeah, and so, but the Ukraine isn't actually, in terms of the measurable perception of corruption, isn't as corrupt as Russia is. But the problem is that the Ukraine is like in the bottom quarter of most, is among the 30 most corrupt countries in the world. And so you can have a lot of interests, both from Russia, from Europe, from the United States, from China, potentially going in there and trying to make deals that would end up that not necessarily would benefit those countries, but would benefit individuals or elites or oligarchs, as they might be called.
Okay, I've got two questions here. Can NATO entrance be a reason contributing to the escalation? Obviously, it is. We know that for sure, but can, given the fact that there is escalation, it suggests that Zelensky is more favoring a sort of West partner rather than an East partner, from
Right.
by the looks of it. So, can we assume that the push to join NATO, it's to sort of secure a partnership with the West rather than Russia in terms of extracting gas?
Yeah, but I think it's a little bit, well, like all these things are a little bit more complicated
Uh-huh.
because there's an issue, there's a long-standing issue with the Ukraine that's been going along, well, since actually even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Before, yeah.
Yeah, but the main issue is that Ukraine is relatively, I keep saying, is poor. Like the GDP per capita in Ukraine is $3,700, in Russia it's 3 times that. It's like $10,000, and of course in the European Union it's like 4 times that. And so the thing is, the problem that Ukraine has is, one is because it has all these problems with corruptions, and that has always been existed. That is one of the major contributing factors to, of course, a country being poor. The more corrupt a country is, the more poverty that exists in the country. So now there's people in Ukraine, they want to stop being poor, obviously, and then they have 2 models essentially that they can follow, which are on either side of their borders.
Right.
It's the Russian model. If Ukraine were to connect itself with Russia and improve relations, there's the idea, presumably, that Ukraine could become as developed as Russia.
Yeah.
And for someone living in Europe, or particularly someone living in the United States, you don't see Russia as an economic powerhouse. Russia has a GDP the size of Italy, right? But compared to the Ukraine, Russia is significantly more developed and advanced. So and then of course they have affinity with Russia in the sense that many Ukrainians have they integrated with Russia. They have family members who are Russian. They have Russian ancestry. They speak Russian.
I know that, Daniel.
Yeah.
My wife.
Oh yeah, your wife. Is
exactly. Yeah. So my father-in-law, he's from Ukraine. He's Kharkov.
One of the.
I have relatives in the area of Donbass from my wife's side, and
right.
I don't want to get political, but we're gonna get there. But there is a lot of things that people do not know. Getting into a bit more on a NATO situation, from what it has been documented, that Ukraine's entry to NATO.
Sorry, that was the thing. I got a little bit distracted with.
Sure.
The thing is, it's a conflict of these 2 things, because the Ukrainians want to be more developed.
Yeah.
So they either have the option of going to Russia or they have the option of going to the EU.
Yeah.
And the 2 of them, they can't do both. They have to do one or the other. Yeah. And so there's like half the population that wants to go towards the European Union, and half the population wants to go towards Russia. And that's they're kind of really mixed together, but generally in the East you have more people favorable towards Russia, and in the West you have people more favorable to the European Union. Exactly. And Zelensky was voted in. Zelensky's on the pro-European side. So that, of course, naturally annoys all the people who are on the pro-Russian side. And then, of course, before that, you had Yanukovych, who was on the pro-Russian side. And so that ends up kind of like the difference is which model do you use to reach development? And so for a lot of people, they don't, I guess a lot of people don't really think that for the Ukraine, joining Russia actually does mean increased development, even though from the European perspective, you say, well, Russia is nowhere near as developed as Europe is. So why would a country prefer Russia? But it's, it is more developed than the Ukraine.
Yeah. It comes down to, I think, preference, to be fair. I mean, you might see native Ukrainians, wanting to be closer, having closer ties to Russia, and the other way around. But it's a case where obviously there is a big push from the West, and there has been a big push from the US to Ukrainians. And I actually have, I wouldn't say interviewed, a friend, have a source in Ukraine that has not even being aware and like thinking that Ukraine never wanted to join NATO. So I'm not sure what sort of role the media plays in the Ukraine. I'm pretty sure that, I mean, we do know that, as I was telling you before, I've seen bombarded buildings blaming Russia's, and the same building on a different post, blaming Ukrainians for the bombardism. So it's very hard to differentiate what's happening. But obviously, by closing Russia outside of the world, because it's actually what's happened. It's like Russia is non-existent right now. By doing this, there is only one side. So, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to get anywhere here, but I'm just saying that people need to be open-minded, because you only have one side playing the game right now. The question, though, that everybody needs to ask themselves is why? Isn't it a bit suspicious? Isn't it a bit suspicious? Because to me, it's very suspicious that it's like Russia doesn't exist right now anywhere, pretty much.
It's almost like Russia's being cancelled. They're trying to cancel the country.
Exactly. It's a big exodus that, well, for now it seems like there is no way back, but obviously there might be. Looking at that, because people were like, well, some people think, what option did Putin have? Some other people think Putin is the new Hitler. Some others are with Zelensky, what a hero. But, knowing the background, the situation can be somehow different. I mean, it is a bit different. The question here is, and from what it seems, I don't know, it would make sense, but maybe it wouldn't be right to speculate, but was Zelensky really pressured by the West to join, and then after the escalation was just, pretty much left alone, betrayed? My source has that opinion, by the way. And these are words from a native Ukrainian, by the way.
Right.
What do you think, though?
Well, there's a bit of speculation, but I've always had this question of why specifically to join NATO for the Ukraine. Why is the Ukraine so eager to join NATO, essentially?
Exactly.
Because if you're going to, the attraction of getting closer to Europe is having better economic ties and improving your economy. And of course, there are countries that are in the European Union that aren't part of NATO, such as Sweden or Finland or Austria.
Exactly.
So why, if Ukraine is going to join the European Union, okay, but why do they have to join NATO?
Why not follow the neutralization?
Yeah,
the neutral path. Yeah.
Why not stay neutral? And I mean, one of the reasons that you can sort of speculate there is that if the Ukraine sort of goes more towards Europe, then Russia is going to feel threatened, and Russia actually has good reason to feel threatened if the Ukraine moves towards Europe.
Exactly.
Then they might do something. And so you need to bring in the military alliance first, and then you can then bring in the economic alliance, which, I mean, I've been reading a bunch of analysts who said this isn't a really good idea. But then, of course, they're Americans, and the United States has a very different perspective on what's happening in Ukraine than Europe does, as we saw.
There is, should I say points or questions? There is a few that come into mind. I'll probably hold it and not forget it. First of all, Putin has actually called a special operation, this invasion, right? He called it a special operation. For the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Now, let's take the first bit first. Right, demilitarization. According to him, the West has promised NATO will not expand an inch. There is a lot of controversy around this, and a lot of articles in the news saying, well, that's not real. And there is others that they say, well, it's not a reason to invade. The second argument, it's fair. But if we consider how many inches the West has moved since that promise. And by the way, I will put this link online, but anybody can go on to the classified documents of the NS archive, which is the National Security Archives, pretty much, of the US. And they can read for themselves that such promises were made. They were made by many different people. Thatcher, George Baker, there is a full list in there. So there is evidence for that stuff. That's why I mentioned it. They have promised. And since then, I think, I'm not sure, but a lot of countries have joined NATO, getting closer and closer to Russia. Now, Ukraine is the last point. There is no one else between them, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want to question whether you think this is obviously invasion is not the right thing, obviously, but there are and there have been genuine and legitimate concerns, okay, from Russia with the expansion of NATO, right?
Right.
Can you explain why?
That has to do with sort of like the strategic position of Russia that's been around for a long time. That basically comes down to it's whether or not Russia is going to be able to be culturally integrated into the West, and that's always been it's been a question that's been going on for hundreds of years. Whether but the main problem is if Russia and Europe are ultimately going to have some kind of confrontation, it's that Western border ends up being a problem for both Europe and for Russia, because you have the what's called the North European Plain, and it sort of extends from northern Germany, and then it goes all the way over to the Ural Mountains, and it's flat. It's very, very hard to defend, whether you're defending against the Russians or you're defending against I suppose, Europeans. And so whoever can get that plane to reach the shortest gap is going to be in a better strategic position. And so there is this book that has the details how the military philosophy of Russia, which is let me see, it's Foundation of Geopolitics. I think it was written by Dugin's last name. He's a Russian. He's also a Russian nationalist. But the general principle is that Russia needs to secure that northern plain as far as to the west as possible. And so now they have Belarus, and basically it's the gap between Belarus and Ukraine. So since they already have Belarus, and if they were to add Ukraine, then that northern plain shrinks dramatically and it's much easier to defend. If the West gets the Ukraine and NATO sets up in Ukraine, then you have this huge, like 4,000-mile front that's along a flat area, and Belarus becomes a salient into the West that is undefensible, and this whole border would be practically indefensible either. And so from a military strategic point of view, they see that controlling the Ukraine is vital for the military stability of the area.
But also to mention the obvious, that by joining NATO, West defense systems, when missiles and bases are actually just going to be installed by the borders of Russia, and Russia doesn't want that. This is exactly what it's threatening their peace, right? Which they were promised not to happen.
Yeah, they were promised that the thing is that NATO was originally created to counter the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Yeah. And the question is, well, now what do we need NATO for? Because the main threat is gone. And then it's like, well, there could be other threats, and there could be China, but China's way over on the other side of the world, and then we don't know. And then Russia was like, well, so either going to disband it or what? And then, but the anti-Russian rhetoric sort of kept going, and NATO kept moving closer to Russia, and it's all designed essentially to fight Russia or the USSR, because the military
So,
philosophy of Russia is
so
very
NATO
similar.
is a big military that was designed for to fight Russia, right?
Pretty much, because even though it's
Right.
designed to fight the USSR, Russia was basically the main big player in the USSR. So,
Yes, yes, of course.
and so you don't see NATO saying, okay, we're not against Russia, we're against someone else, and now we're going to be changing our doctrine
Yeah.
and the military philosophy to go against someone else. NATO
Hmm.
still has well, Russia's the enemy, and so
Hmm. But
naturally, it's understandable for Russia to feel threatened.
it also seems like becomes a political and economic sort of agenda change rather than just military.
Yeah. And then, of course, since 2016, there's been this increase in rhetoric about Russia being an enemy because of the 2016 elections in the United States.
Hmm.
The Russia was accused of interfering in the elections, and then Russia's
Uh-huh.
then, of course, seen as the enemy of the United States. And then you had the two different political views on it, because you had the
Right.
Trump administration was denying it was happening, because if they admitted that Russia had interfered in the election, that would undermine the legitimacy
Hmm.
of the Trump presidency, and so then that created a controversy in the United States, which led to a lot more talk about how Russia's a threat,
Yeah.
and then that helped reorient NATO
Hmm.
towards Russia as well.
Yeah. You mentioned this book,
Hmm.
and I something came straight to my mind. I'm not sure if you remember or familiar. George Kennan, who was the charge in the Soviet Union to the Secretary of State, he sent a
Oh,
long telegram in 1946. It's called long telegram because it was a telegram of 5,000 words,
right.
detailing pretty much. Well, it's like how should the bear be treated? So there is this argument that this long telegram played a significant role in how U.S. foreign policy was designed from back in obviously 46 on, but it seems to be a case now. Well, maybe I don't know what you would think that if you read the document, you will understand that what we currently see is some sort of peaking of the bear.
The events sort of lead to poking the bear instead of taming the bear.
Something like that. I mean, and yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, since you have this long telegram and you know how you're supposed to tame it, instead you
they're
pick it
doing the
exactly.
exact opposite of what the
Yeah,
telegram
so there is
suggests.
there is an argument there that is some sort of there was a way to push, I would say, and push. Obviously, in some cases it's a bit evident. For example, Nord Stream 2 now it's like also NATO, and then we go to the to some sort of the second argument, apart from militarization that Putin had for the reason of the operation, of course, to denazify
Right.
Ukraine, which I mean, I'm not connecting this to the US in any way, but there is personally, but there is some evidence that suggest, first of all, just to make a statement here, right?
Hmm.
There is evidence that we know it from the Ukraine government as well, that a few months after the Crimea situation, Ukraine recaptured Mariupol from the Russian-backed separatists.
Right.
And what happened back then is they integrated the National Guard of Ukraine in 2014. They integrated the National Guard of Ukraine into the military of the Ukraine. Now, the National Guard of Ukraine are far right sort of people, and that was pretty much the beginning of the battalion of Azov, which,
Right.
according to research, 10 to 20% of them are neo-Nazis.
Right.
So I know a lot of people come out saying that these are just reasons for they're not reason for evasion. It's just they're just used as a way to just invade. But there is evidence, I'm telling you, that the far right has been in Ukraine and still is in the Ukraine. In fact, the founder of this organization, which is, as I just to repeat, integrated into the Ukraine's military and has become bigger and bigger. The founder is currently, or it was actually up to 2019, if I'm not mistaken, the head of the police in Kiev.
Oh.
Yeah, and one of the it was founded by oligarchs, obviously, and at the same time, I think one of the oligarchs, or one of the members of the battalion, also became an MP. Now, in the latest election in 2019, all of these groups that they are far right, I repeat, have made an attempt to join parliament. They didn't get to the threshold of 5%. And of course, that doesn't allow them to be in parliament. But there are people in the parliament that have been members in the past. And there is evidence, striking evidence, that there is neo-Nazi Ukrainian militia. In fact, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights even wrote a report on the human rights situation in the Ukraine back in 2015, right? And after this, even before this, both Canada and United States announced that they will not support to train this Azov regiment because Ukraine has been supported financially by US since 2001, if I'm not mistaken. So both announced no more support to train the Azov regiment. So they were pretty much trained by Canada and the United States. After, of course, this document came out from the, or before this document came out. But the interesting fact is that the US lifted this ban the year after. So from 2016 onwards, Azov regiment, which I repeat, 10 to 20% Nazis, neo-Nazis, have been trained by US from pressure that was due to pressure from the Pentagon. There's been several attempts in 2019 by US Congress Representative Max Rose, and also last attempt from Elisa Slotkin to designate Azov as a foreign terrorist organization. But that's never happened. Ukraine has emerged as a new hub for the far right across the world. It actually is the only country, Ukraine, the only country that they have integrated far right militia in their military. Just to make this parentheses, because a lot of people think that the arguments of Putin, I'm not saying I am pro-war, obviously, and I'm not pro-invasion, right? But there is evidence that the claims of Putin, in both cases, not moving east another inch for security concerns, plus there is neo-Nazism in Ukraine, are both, well, documented and very well evident. So here's that. Now, there is something more interesting. You know how social media work. And obviously, ISIS has been banned from Facebook. Ku Klux Klan has been banned from Facebook. The Azov battalion also was banned from Facebook. Recently, Facebook lifted the ban. of a far-right extremist group acting in the areas of the separatist areas, I would say. They lifted the ban, claiming that it's like an exception to praise the regiment just for defending Ukraine. Twitter did something similar, following some hate speech. So, I mean, I don't know if I want to say anything more than that, to be honest. As I said, it's a very sensitive matter, and I don't want to get people upset. I don't want to upset people. I am with the people, though, and I'm here to... and the people that are in my YouTube channel also know me, that I will always try to find insights and evidence. There is a lot of other things that I'm not mentioning because I have not made confirmation of reports. But I do know for a fact that there has been, for these 8 years since Crimea, there have a lot of people died, as I was saying in the beginning. There is also something very interesting, maybe you don't know, but there is about 150,000 Greeks living in the area of Odessa, Mariupol, and Crimea in general. 150,000 Greeks. And
right, because of the historic connection.
There is historic connection as well, because Crimea was, I mean, if you remember Troy and the movie with Brad Pitt as well, Troy was around that area. And ancient Greece in general is where it was. I mean, 2,500 years now, Greeks have been there. These people have suffered from the far-right extremists. We're not talking about the Ukrainian government here or Ukrainian people, right? We're talking about far-right extremists that are integrated with Ukrainian forces. Okay? There's a different thing, just to make the distinction. Yeah. I don't want to go into details about some witnesses and what they have reported, because it will sadden a lot of people to what is happening in these areas nowadays. You just don't think that this is the world that we live in. I just wanted to make this parenthesis, mainly starting from the point of the two main reasons that Putin invaded. And I repeat, I'm against invasion. For me, you want to save the people of Lugansk and Donbas. The solution would be to just, protect them. No more invasion. But it seems like a case where more than just the protection of the people are in stake here, rather than just that at stake. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like more of an excuse. The same thing, it's like every country, of course, has their group of neo-Nazis or accused of being neo-Nazis. You have the AfD in Germany, and of course in the United States they routinely call Republicans Nazis, and then they also call many Democrats are also called Nazis, and you have the Brexiteers were called Nazis. Everyone's called Nazis. So kind of like the generic excuse to go out and do something that you're not supposed to do is to accuse the person of being a Nazi.
I think there is a bit of a difference, because they actually call themselves that. It's 10 to 20%. A lot of them are that. They even have a website. They train kids, 13 years old, 14 years old. There is pictures of them all over the place. It's not something new. There is evidence of this exists. And just another small parenthesis.
Exist. I mean, it's like it's a small group of people.
Yes, it is. Actually, it's about 900 of them in just in this group.
Right.
But I will tell you something, and I will just leave it there so that people understand what's happening. 10 days ago, a Greek of the area, who's of course speaking Russian,
right,
was shot dead because he spoke Russian in front of one of these far-right extremists. So I don't think it's a case where that is not. It's like, it's someone who's a bit more to the right rather than to the left. It's a case of can I call Nazism? Is this
right?
something?
I mean, if you definitely extreme xenophobia.
They've also been vocal that, they will not take Russian soldiers as prisoners. They will slaughter them like pigs and don't give them the option of surrendering. So my question is, and maybe a question to everybody who's listening, why is the US not taking the United Nations human rights report since 2016 in mind? Why they're not doing anything, and why the US keeps funding and supporting this group? This is just a question for everybody to think about. I mean, there is no answer. I don't want an answer. It's just for everybody to think about what is really happening there. It's not what we see on the surface or in the news. So it came out. I didn't want to, but it came out.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, every situation is complicated, and there's more things. There's always a narrative that gets pushed in the media and then to try to simplify it into these are good guys and those are the bad guys, and then everything that the good guys do is good, and everything the bad guys do is bad, and then. Every situation is really complicated. You're going to have a lot of people doing things that they shouldn't do on both sides, and then everyone's going to exaggerate it to the point of no, they're all like that.
There is one thing for sure, that the good guys are the people, and the people now, I mean, are the ones that pay for it for whatever reason. For whatever reason this is happening, for all the reasons we explained, even, which I guess all make sense. Who pays for that is the people. And then very likely with all the sanctions, and who knows how this is going to escalate, that is going to spill over into the markets, into the European economy as well. I mean, a lot of people have left their houses, they're going to end up into Europe. How is the labor market going to be affected by this?
Yeah, the thing about sanctions, of course, is that when you're sanctioning someone, it also affects you. It's like you say, well, we're not going to sell. There's a lot of these companies saying that they're not going to ship stuff to Russia for a while. Well, that means that you don't have that sale, you don't have that income. In the case of, for example, like Volkswagen, it's one of the recent ones to say that they aren't going to be selling any more cars in Russia. Well, right now, there's a shortage of components to make cars, and so there isn't a lack of cars. So it isn't like Volkswagen is going to have to go out and fire anyone because they're no longer sending stuff to Ukraine. Now, but there are other companies that would be in that position.
Imagine that Volkswagen was one of the latest to put sanctions on Russia. Actually, Volkswagen, EA Sports, EA. They're not going to they're not going to feature the Russian team any longer. Volkswagen, no more cars in Russia. What else? I think McDonald's maybe not. I think was the only one that stayed. But what is happening around the world? It's crazy.
Yeah, it's just it's almost like mass hysteria. And like the one that I was reading recently was IMDb, the Internet Movie Database website. They have a list of I think it's the 100 best films. Right. And on those, one of them is there was a Russian film.
It's not any longer.
And they took it out.
Yeah.
The film was made back 36 years ago.
Did you hear the other one? No. In Italy, they will not teach Tchaikovsky anymore. I mean,
Tchaikovsky, of course, is
Chelsea,
totally
Abramovich has to sell Chelsea.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, but what happened when Afghanistan was invaded?
Yeah.
I don't want an answer. I'm just saying, what happened then? What happened when, since 1952, Turkey has been a part of NATO? What happened to Cyprus when they invaded and they annexed the island? And I live on the Greek side. Yeah. What happened since then? Where is NATO? And Ukraine is not even in NATO.
Yeah.
But poor people, I think they were expecting more from NATO. And what happens now, it's NATO is coming together out of a sudden and with speeds that we've never seen in the past. And that is very curious.
I Well, that also probably has to do with social media because it seems to be initially that everyone expected the Ukraine to just get rolled over really quickly. Or I mean,
Yeah.
rolled over might not be the best way or the best description, but the Russians expected the war to last, well, the intervention, as they call it, to last really short.
Yeah.
And it seems like most people in the West sort of expected that that would happen, that Russia would take Ukraine. And it wasn't until the Ukrainians resisted for 3 or 4 days, and you had this sort of outpouring of general popular support for the Ukrainians that suddenly the sanctions came out to be much more severe. There
Yeah.
was initially a few sanctions that were imposed on Russia that weren't all that severe. They went after some of the small banks, and they sanctioned one or two of the oligarchs, but the big move didn't happen until 3 or 4 days into the war. It happened over the weekend, and then it was on Monday. It was Monday, wasn't it, that Germany then would announce that they were going to increase their military spending.
Yeah, which was another way to pick the bear.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing: everybody's united. Everybody sends guns. Nobody goes in.
Well, of course. Yeah. No one wants to be the one.
Yeah, it will turn into something more serious. I am sure if that happened. I mean, we do not know what's ahead of us. That's for sure. We just hope that this thing is going to be settled soon, and no more people are going to end up being away. If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that really worries me, of course, is that when you have so many people being against Putin, and now that's by extension, now a lot of people are going against Russia in general.
Yeah, all the people are, because social media are crazy.
Yeah.
About this. There's a propaganda, but it comes only from the one side. I mean, we both know propaganda is coming always from both sides, but this is just one-sided.
Yeah, and so the problem is that if everyone is so against Putin, then you don't leave a way out. You don't leave a way to end the conflict, because everyone's going to demand that something bad happen to Putin. And
you know what the problem is, apart from the direct effects, obviously, the problem is that there is hatred against Russians too.
Yeah.
Because I've already seen this. My wife had an episode. So we're not just talking about, the problem in Ukraine. We're talking about the impact that what's happening right now, it's having right now all over Europe, I would guess. And imagine it's just the start of it.
Yeah, so what really worries me is that it's just the start and not the end.
So, us, as people, we just have to wait. As
there isn't much we can do.
What do we do? Assuming, with everything that we've talked about, okay, assuming there is this thing is going probably to last a bit longer than what we always think. Obviously, if there is de-escalation and things go fine, then everything is going to pump, and we're just going to wait for the Fed to provide the natural course for the markets, right?
Yeah.
So what would that course be if we assume everything de-escalates?
Oh, well, the de-escalation is kind of the easier model, but then that depends on what kind of deal is worked out, essentially. But I mean, I guess the big thing is that if they reach some kind of agreement to have a ceasefire or something, then the risk of oil being cut off goes away. And then, of course, you'd see a significant drop in the price of oil, and then potentially inflation would go down, and then you get a return of risk appetite. So it's still kind of if you expect the situation to be resolved relatively soon, I guess it's more of a buy the dip kind of situation, because then once the uncertainty is gone, you get the return of risk appetite.
I see. So the sooner the de-escalation happens, the more the chances that there's going to be a correction rather than just the reversal, right?
Yeah.
And that is for oil.
Well, that goes for pretty much most things, because stock markets have been going down mostly out of concern over what's going to happen, this uncertainty.
Yeah, but
The price of oil
they
is
have been peaking of the past few days, including the Bitcoin, right? So if things
right.
de-escalate, we expect further upside.
Yeah,
Yeah,
at least in terms of risk appetite.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
you say one thing you wouldn't say that gold would necessarily be going up because that would be the flip side
Yeah.
of risk. And so you'd probably see the treasuries go down, so you have lower yields. And then the other problem is there's a disparate impact on Europe and the United States. So generally speaking, the United States isn't impacted by the Ukraine issue, but Europe is. So the longer it lasts, the more the separation between the United States and Europe would be.
There has been rhetoric. You know, the Ukrainian government started collecting Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general for support, which was a
Right.
clear idea, of course, to help them in these difficult times.
Yeah.
That has increased rhetoric, especially on crypto Twitter, that, well, Bitcoin is going to go crazy now, up, because maybe also with sanctions, Russia going to start using it. A lot of people think this
Yeah.
is because of Russia using Bitcoin. So do you think that has had an impact, and do you think that it will keep impacting prices? And plus, to make a parenthesis, there is also rhetoric coming from the US side that they're going to restrict somehow in their own mind, for understanding what Bitcoin is all about. They're going to restrict Russia from transacting with Bitcoin. I mean, I'm sure they can still do it anyway because there is also the OTC deals. So what is your
Well, it depends on what the exchanges do, I guess. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like there's been a bit of a flip because I remember quite recently, Russia was trying to ban, or not necessarily ban, but was restricting Bitcoin because it was being used by the opposition in Russia. And now Russia seems to be much more interested in crypto. And then, of course, before then, the U.S. was criticizing Russia for wanting to constrain the access to crypto to opposition. And now the United States is talking about restricting crypto. So you got a bit of a flip there. But I think in general, the more risk that you have, particularly with more interventionist policies, there'd probably be more people more interested in saying, hey, I'd like to have something that isn't necessarily tied to the government always approving
or
of
to the dollar
what I do.
that is losing
Or to the
value, especially as a reserve currency, as Fed chair talked about. Apparently now he's he's into a new game.
Yeah.
Maybe he said maybe a second reserve currency would be.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that they're really pushing a digital dollar, but the problem is ultimately the government. It's not. Everyone tries to blame the Fed for it, but the Fed is really reacting in trying to keep up with what the government's doing.
Yeah.
And so if the Fed comes out with a different currency, or you create a new reserve currency, it's not going to change the impact that you're going to have from the government.
Is it going to change the impact to the cryptocurrencies at all?
I would doubt it because cryptocurrencies are just responding to what's happening with the currency, and the currency is responding to basically what the government's doing. In the central banks are sort of a proxy for what the government's doing because the central banks have to. The central banks are each one dealing with a different problem from the government, but it's ultimately the government that's doing. It's like in the United States, the federal government has a problem. They're spending significantly more money than they're taking in. They have, and of course, the United States as a country has a large trade deficit,
and a huge debt.
So the Fed has to deal with that particular problem. Whereas in Europe, they have another problem is that you have all these bureaucratic restrictions and you have a significant amount of regulations. So even though the countries, particularly like Germany, doesn't have a significant amount of deficit, it has structural surplus, well, except for the pandemic, but they'll most likely go back to having structural surplus. So spending a lot of money isn't a problem that Europe has. It's a problem of the economies just can't grow because of how hard it is to actually engage in economic activities in Europe. And so this gets represented in the ECB taking different policies. So you have this low interest, like negative interest rates that ultimately, in the long term, has a problem. It negatively impacts the economy.
Yeah, especially now with I mean, how inflation is rising. I mean, what are you gonna do? You're gonna put rates at -10,
Yeah.
or you're gonna go to like 2 or 3 or 4? How? I
Yeah,
mean, I do not. I just honestly don't see a way out of this.
yeah, the Fed can't significantly raise rates. Everyone's saying the Fed could raise rates like eight times, seven
Yeah.
times this year. That's probably not going to happen because if they raise rates, then that increases the amount of money that the federal government has to pay to service the
Exactly.
debt.
Exactly.
So that's going to be significantly constraining the government.
Exactly.
And here in Europe, they have the other problem that they can't raise rates because the economy isn't growing. They have structural problems. And the central banks have been saying, there's structural problems. The government needs to address structural problems, and the government doesn't do it.
So just a quick question for just your opinion on the economic landscape going forward, given the new situation around Russia and Ukraine. At the current state of affairs, obviously, we cannot speculate for anything else.
Right.
How does it change the landscape going forward? Maybe even for BTC, if that makes.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think it significantly increased the risk profile. So, I mean, right up until there's the issue of whether or not the annexation of those two breakaway provinces constitutes an invasion. Some people argue it is, and some people argue it doesn't. But it is taking a piece of territory. But
of course,
if Russia had stayed at that point, the amount of risk profile wouldn't have probably gone up very significantly. So it's just been since the actual larger invasion of Ukraine, maybe we could call it that. Since then, that significantly increased the risk profile. So up until that point, we're basically going to go. COVID would be over, and then we'd kind of go to a sort of normalization. And there was already a differential between the United States and Europe again because. Then of course you had the problem with China. China had managed to maintain COVID, having a significant amount of impact from COVID. And so now they're having large numbers of COVID cases because of the Omicron. They're not really able to stop it. And so they've been shutting down different cities to try and control it. So China might actually go through a difficult period, relatively short, relatively quick, where they have to deal with Omicron. And so that might have a depressing effect on their economy. And so then, Europe was the fourth quarter GDP for Germany had already gone negative. So Europe was, before COVID happened, Europe was basically sliding into a recession. And then COVID happened. And then if Europe goes back to where it was just before COVID, then it's basically sliding into another recession. Then, of course, and in the case of the United States, you have a better increased economic growth, not necessarily as much as they could potentially have. But so then you'll get that differential. The United States economies probably would be going higher, and Europe's economy would probably sort of stay where it was. But now with the increased risk profile, as long as the situation in Ukraine sort of it keeps going on, that increases particularly the fear in Europe, investor fear. And so that would presumably depress the European economy. The sanctions do have an effect on Russia and also have an effect on Europe.
They already have, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is that it's going to have a bigger impact on Russia, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to have an impact on Europe. And so then you could probably see Europe maybe slipping into another recession, whereas in the United States might be able to grow for a little while longer.
Well, I guess the situation really benefits them most than anybody else.
True. The United States is largely unaffected except for some. Well, they managed to they put on sanctions on Russia, but the key things like oil and gas, they're not sanctioning. Titanium, they're not sanctioning. Uranium exports, which they also need.
And whatever the loss, I guess they will be offset and they will reap some rewards by selling natural gas to Germany instead of Russia.
That too, but
Yeah.
I think the total amount of natural gas, I have to look into that to see how big of an impact it would have on the economy. But then you have the increasing interest rates. How fast does the Fed increase rates is going to start slowing down the U.S. economy. So then probably the last time the Fed increased rates was 2018, and then you had the stock market go down. You had the slump, and then everyone started worrying about, hey, there's a recession coming, and then the Fed had to cut rates. If you remember, the Fed cut rates back at the start of, not the end of 2000. No, it started 2019.
Okay, just to sum this up, do you think if we assume the situation with Russia and Ukraine remains as is without escalating, we're going to hang on mainly on policy changes around the world, and BTC is going to be affected in what way?
Oh, I would go with the risk profile. For now, it would probably be depressed till the point that it's resolved, and then if the pressures remain as they are, it could have a bounce once they reach some kind of agreement.
And how do you see risk involving the risk that comes from policy changes involving? Because we're talking about one rate hike in March, likely, and then going forward.
Oh, well, initially there's even speculation that there'd be two interest rate hikes. I mean, a double interest rate, a 50-point interest rate hike at the next meeting. Now that's gone down to, it's pretty much guaranteed that there'll be an interest rate hike at the next Fed meeting. And the thing is that the Fed might try to raise interest rates a little bit more aggressively initially, but then sort of plateau it out, because the Fed can get away with 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 interest rates before it starts significantly eating into the economy and significantly increasing the cost of credit. So they might raise interest rates 1 or 2 or maybe 3 times, and then just not raise interest rates before, which isn't something that the Fed normally does, because this is one of the problems that the Fed has when they start raising rates. It's sort of like, well, they raised rates, then they're going to keep raising them. Because if you go back through history, they've always done it that way. They start raising rates and they just keep raising rates until the economy goes into recession.
Right.
So maybe they'll do that. But I mean, there's a chance that they won't.
So let me ask you this: according to history, has markets gone up at any point while the Fed was raising rates?
For a period of time, they did. They kept going up until they reached an inflection point, and then they crashed.
Until when? Sorry.
Until there's an inflection point, and then they crash.
Which is going to be a bit evident by what sort of signals?
Oh, well, that's the $1 million question.
I mean, are we looking at inflation coming down at some point, or what exactly? Given the current situation as well, of course, we're looking at the Fed's balance sheet. I mean, obviously, yeah, it is the $1 million question, but generally speaking.
Yeah, well, so far there's been the yield curve inversion, which has, of the last 10 recessions, has been able to predict the last 10 of them, even including COVID, essentially. So that would be when the interest rate on the 10-year goes below the interest rate of the 2-year Treasury bill in the United States. That might be sort of, that happens, and then anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, there'll be a recession.
Right. So the moment we see the 2-year reaching the 10, we sell.
Yes, as soon as it inverts, then you might want to start looking into becoming very liquid.
Yeah, but
the other signal is something actually that I heard earlier today, which is a little bit worrisome, is lack of liquidity. When right before the COVID crash, the the COVID crash, if I remember correctly, started on a Tuesday in, what was it, the second week of March. But on Friday, there's significant restriction in liquidity. The market still managed to rise a little bit, but it was very evident that there was lack of liquidity in the market. So if you have lack of liquidity in the market for a period of time, that could be sort of a signal that things will go down.
Everybody's gonna sell, yeah.
Yeah.
In the interim, how would you see the hikes impacting risk assets? Corrections and then up until the inflection point, or it will depend on how hard they go on rising? For example, obviously, if there's going to be a double hike, that's going to be bearish for risk assets, including BTC. But should we get one hike? Would it just be a correction and then up? Or
I would expect that so far the next hike has already been priced in. Everyone's really expecting it.
Maybe even two.
So the first two probably won't do anything
much. Yeah, okay.
But then when you get to the fourth, then they could start getting a little.
So
worried.
There might be a period of about maybe 2 to 3 months. Who knows? Maybe even more than that. 4, 8, probably. Well, we're looking closer to the end of the year. Then we might.
Yeah, if you go by history, most of the recessions happen in September, October. So you have a period of optimism during spring and summer, but that might be significantly reduced because of the situation in Ukraine. I think realistically, it depends on how fast they get that solved.
Yeah. And that, of course, would all depend. We're just talking monetary policy here. That will all mainly be affected by the situation around Ukraine and Russia, as we have seen over the past week or so. I mean, economic reports or anything didn't really make any difference. Everything is like highly speculative as we speak, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be really careful when you put money into the markets, obviously, and especially when you have a lot of volatility going around. Like right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, you have increased volatility. Of course, that means you can do more trades and hopefully make more money, but you also have to be more careful.
Way more careful. Tight stops. Yeah. Okay. Well, Daniel, that's been a long conversation, and I think many people will not get to the end. I hope they will. I think it's a very interesting topic. Thank you for helping out here, because it would be a bit boring to do it alone, and there wouldn't be any arguments either.
Yeah, well, it's always good to chat
and record it.
Perspectives.
Chat and record it. Well, thank you very much. And if there is high demand, obviously, we're going to do another one of them. So get ready for the next.
Awesome. We're looking forward to it.
Okay, bye.
Bye.